Go a long way.
Okay. So let me welcome you out to our event today. I'm Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Foley Institute. And it's really my pleasure to have with us one of my good friends and a terrific scholar, Melinda Gann Hall. Melinda is a professor of political science at Michigan State University. She's a past recipient of the Distinguished Faculty Award at MSU. Melinda's received her PhD from the University of New Orleans in 1983 and joined the MSU faculty in 1996. She's been a former chair of both the State Policy and Politics section as well as the Law and Courts section of the American Political Science Association. And she's one of the nation's leading authorities on state judicial politics, with particular interest in judicial behavior and judicial elections. Her research has appeared in the leading journals of political science, including the American Political Science Review, the American Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics, and Political Research Quarterly. Professor Hall's latest book is entitled Attacking Judges, How Campaign Advertising Influences State Supreme Court Elections, published by the Stanford University Press, and that will be the basis of her remarks today. Join me now in welcoming Melinda Gann Hall.
Thank you, Cornell, and thanks to the Foley Institute and Washington State University for having me here. It's been a wonderful visit, and I am honored to be here to talk about my work. I'm going to talk about a controversial subject where a lot of people have difficulty accepting social science findings, so this should make for an interesting conversation. But what do we think about campaign advertising? If we ask the average person, do campaign ads work, or do they have positive or negative effects? There are a couple of conventional wisdoms that are fairly universal. The first is to think that campaign negativity, especially really harsh attacks, the swift boating of John Kerry. Swift boating is now a verb because of that ad. The swift boating of John Kerry. Do those ads work? And most people would say yes. So people who have a particularly effective negative ad are going to destroy the opposition and win. We also think that campaign negativity demoralizes citizens, demobilizes the electorate, and basically delegitimizes government. The primary argument for this came from two political scientists, Ansel Baer and Iyengar, who published two highly influential pieces on campaign negativity, in which they attributed the decline in voter turnout in the United States to negative advertising. And in fact, they said that negativity in campaigning was the single biggest explanation for declining voter turnout in the United States. The idea is these ads turn us off, we don't like them, we find them offensive, and from these ads we conclude that not only is the person being attacked, unfairly being attacked, but it suggests something very negative systemically about the American government and election process. And so the idea is these ads have very harmful consequences. We've had a lot of studies of campaign advertising, not only from political scientists, but also from people in communications departments. And the findings are very consistent. There are certainly some exceptions. When we have hundreds of studies, there are always going to be exceptions. But generally speaking, these studies have shown us that actually campaign negativity has very little effect on winning and losing, that these ads are not determining the outcomes of races. And not only that, but what happened, and why would that be? Because when you see an ad, the average person sees an ad, they're going to view it through a partisan lens. So if you're a Democrat and you see an ad about a Democrat, you're going to say that's ridiculous. If you're a Democrat and you see a negative ad about a Republican, you're going to go, well, of course, he's a Republican, right? And so we filter information through our partisanship. But also other studies show that even when there is an effect, these effects dissipate very, very rapidly. So there's no long-term effect from these ads. And not only that, but they don't demobilize or alienate the electorate. And we've studied this all sorts of ways, too, of survey experiments, of laboratory experiments, of looking at aggregate data. Lots of different studies have attempted to assess Whether campaign ads demobilize, and the answer seems to be no. And in fact, harsh campaigning often mobilizes voters. It has exactly the opposite effect. Why? Because it's interesting. We see these ads, we're interested by them, it raises our interest in the election and motivates us to vote. So the findings from scientists actually show precisely the opposite of conventional wisdom. So why do people go negative? Well, some people believe piercing attacks actually work, right? And that's certainly the line that a lot of campaign firms are going to sell. Also, sometimes there is a bold attempt to win an election, and particularly when there might be something actually negative to say about the other candidate. That the other candidate was on the Riviera vacationing with a major litigant before the court, and that justice would be voting in those cases not only specifically immediately before the court, but over the long term. So that's an important piece of information. Yeah, again, that might be a circumstance. But a lot of times, campaigns are about focusing the agenda. So what you want to do is raise issues from which we benefit as the advertiser, whether that's a candidate, a political party, a group. We want to control the campaign agenda. So this election is about immigration. It's not about anything else. It's about immigration. This election is about abortion. It's not about anything else. It's about abortion. So that kind of strategizing often can be very effective. And not only that, but negative advertising attracts media attention, which gets you more free advertising. So everybody starts talking about your negative ad. And more people are getting interested and involved in the election. So there are lots of reasons why candidates and sponsors of these ads, outside candidates' campaigns, actually sponsor negative ads. But again, the effects have been greatly overestimated. But what about judges? So are judges different? Normative theories of judging certainly would suggest so. Judges aren't political actors. Judges aren't partisan actors. Judges are there to interpret the law, not give us their views about what a particular issue should involve. And the general idea is that judges have to remain above the political fray in order to retain their legitimacy, that this is a critical part of our acceptance of judicial power, is that we don't see judges as ordinary politicians. That would be extremely destructive to our acceptance of judicial decisions. Well, let me add first, before I talk about any of this literature, that a lot of this work, we're really in the nascent stages of understanding campaigning and electioneering in judicial elections. There have been a lot of recent studies that have made progress, but we're still a long way from really understanding this in the same way that congressional scholars, for example, understand campaigning, or presidential scholars. But having said that, we have evidence so far that contradicts this notion that citizens can't think of judges as both electioneers and as good judges. Probably the best evidence so far is Jim Gibson's work, Electing Judges, where he looked at the impact of a lot of different campaign activities on citizens' positive perceptions of courts. He looked at negative ads, he looked at campaign contributions, he looked at policy talk in judicial campaign advertisements and so forth. And he found that while some of these things may have a small negative impact, that negative impact is overwhelmed by the positive impact of voting, of participating in an election. Elections are legitimizing institutions. We know that. And so what Jim concludes is that the net effects, even with all of these things going on, are still quite positive. As a related matter, I've done a lot of work with Chris Bono and without Chris Bono. A lot of other people have studied competition, partisanship in elections, intense exchanges between candidates, and big spending, and whether those have a negative effect on the willingness of voters to participate. And the answer is no. Again, it has exactly the opposite effect. So voters are mobilized by the same sorts of things that mobilize voters in any other election. So there's some evidence to question how this simplistic idea is inaccurate. So we do need to have more nuanced approaches to thinking about judicial legitimacy and how that fits with judicial elections. But there are some basic political science theories that speak to this too, and basically those theories point to the rules of the game. Judicial elections, or at least some of them, may be different, not because judges are intrinsically different, but because the elections are intrinsically different. Because in some cases, we take party labels off the ballot, and that has consequences for voters. And then in other cases, we not only take party affiliation off the ballot, we also don't allow challengers, which are retention elections. And so we have these competing perspectives. So are judges like the traditional sort of simple normative legal construction, or is it that in fact elections are elections and judicial elections might be different just because the elections themselves are different? Here's a shot of the current methods for selecting judges in the United States. Partisan elections, nonpartisan elections, the Missouri plan, which involves retention elections, and appointment systems. West Virginia is going to change its method of selection with the next round of elections. So West Virginia will no longer be a partisan election state, and we'll see what happens with that switch to nonpartisan elections. But as you can see, and as you know, of course, Washington is a nonpartisan election state, along with Michigan, my current home state, and so forth, as opposed to Alabama, Illinois, Louisiana, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, Texas, and West Virginia, that at some point use partisan elections. And I'll say more about appointment systems at the end, because I think we want to think about issues with appointment systems as well. But again, this gives you an idea of how the states align on this dimension. I'm going to try, let's see. Cornell, can you, again, I'm sorry, I am not an IBM user, or a Windows user. I want to play, so how do I tap the, here we go, there we go, and then there, thank you. So let's see, I want to show you, it's not going to show me the ads, so we're not going to get to see the ads. Yes, these are QuickTime, so sorry, again, I apologize for the, it was?
Yes, but no.
It says QuickTime not available. Yeah, I don't think it's going to play. So I'm getting the QuickTime not. Yeah. Yeah, it's in QuickTime. You don't have QuickTime. So yeah, so again, I apologize. This is a Mac Windows issue. So it doesn't matter. So I was going to show you some negative ads, and one of them, and the one that some of you saw when you were sitting here and we were playing with the technology, is an ad by Carol Hunstein, who was a member of the Georgia Supreme Court. So this is an ad aired by an incumbent, just as an example of a really nasty ad. And I've looked at most of these ads, and I would I think I would rank this first in terms of really nasty ads. So what does the ad say? So she's an incumbent. This is a 2006 race for the Georgia Supreme Court. Justice Hunstein is the incumbent. She's predicted to win by a sizable majority. Justices in Georgia don't lose. But for some reason, she chose to air this particular ad. And it says something like, the opponent does not have the right values for the Georgia Supreme Court. He was sued by his mother. He was sued by his only sister. She says he threatened to kill her when she was 8 months pregnant. Mike Wiggins, wrong values, wrong for the Georgia Supreme Court. Now, that's pretty nasty. Okay. And I try to figure out if it's true. And what he said, so I don't know if he tried to kill her, okay? I have no idea about that. But there was some litigation. They were doing something with his mother's estate, and from all accounts, it was some relatively congenial maneuvering to settle his mother's estate. And so, again, there was some truth in the ad, but some of it really couldn't be verified. So these are the kinds of things that are being broadcast. Cliff Taylor in my state, the Chief Justice, the sleeping judge. So it starts out with a picture of a bed, you know, Sleeping Beauty, and how Sleeping Beauty is a lovely fairy tale, but not in a court. And so here's Cliff Taylor, who slept through this prosecution, and the litigants don't know how he possibly could have made a reasonable decision when he didn't hear it. And the caption is, "Sleeping Judge Cliff Taylor needs a wake-up call." So again, these are the kinds of things that are being broadcast. So dignified, no. Accurate, I don't know. But did they determine the outcomes of the race? No, Carol Hunstein won, but she would have anyway. The odds of her being defeated were exceedingly low, and Cliff Taylor lost, in fact, but that was also when most of the Republicans were thrown out of office in Michigan. So he was part of that Republican anti-Bush sentiment that swept through that set of elections. And so there are lots of alternative reasons why those ads may have appeared to work. So what I wanted to look at much more systematically was, in fact, do attack ads reduce the electoral performance of incumbent? And do attack ads demobilize the electorate? And are there differences between partisan and nonpartisan elections? So what I'm going to show you this afternoon really is more breadth than depth. I wanted to cover a lot of the major findings rather than talking about a specific few. So I will talk to you about both of these issues simultaneously and again, confront the conventional wisdom. What am I looking at? State Supreme Court elections from 2002 to 2008. I collected these from official sources. Why 2002? Because we don't really have advertising data before that. Why 2008? Because that's when those were the data available at the time I did the study. And I'm using television ads that were collected by CMAG, the Campaign Media Analysis Group, and are reported by the Brennan Center for Justice, Justice at Stake Campaign, and the National Institute for Money in State Politics. So, is there any descriptive data that would suggest that incumbents are really being harmed by these elections? What the Brennan Center tells us is that 2000 was a watershed, as they call it, in judicial elections. That is, this is when there was a big influx of money, but especially campaign advertising. And their argument is that everything changed in 2000. But if you look at these graphs, and I'm showing all races and contested races, but if you look, there's certainly no evidence in partisan elections, contested partisan elections, that incumbents are doing worse. In fact, they seem to be doing better. And there's some evidence in 2008, which is a particularly low point for contested nonpartisan elections, but historically not really that different from things that we've seen before. And then support goes back up in 2010. Same with ballot roll-off. Is there evidence of tremendous ballot roll-off? And what is ballot roll-off? Let me just define that very quickly. With judicial elections and down ballot races, we don't look at voter turnout. Why not? Because those elections don't really have the most important impact on whether a voter goes to the polls or not. So if we use voter turnout, we would have to account for all of those things that get people to go to the polls in the first place. A much more parsimonious way of thinking about this is to say, let's compare the number of people who voted in a state Supreme Court election compared to the top race on the ballot. And by doing that, we avoid all those specification problems when the state Supreme Court election is not driving voter turnout. So with ballot roll-off is the percentage of voters who do not vote in the state Supreme Court election, but who did vote in the top race. So the higher that number, the lower the voter participation in judicial elections. So higher is bad, lower is good from the perspective of citizen participation. So is there any evidence of tremendous ballot roll-off? And again, not really. So tentatively, we don't see any dramatic changes. We see some pretty interesting changes since the 80s. There's a wonderful new book out by Bert Kritzer looking at all judicial elections from 1948 to, I think Bert goes to 2012, maybe even 2014. And what he's going to show you is that in the fundamental features of these races, not a lot has changed. So some has changed. We advertise more, we spend more, but in terms of incumbent percentages, defeat rates, ballot roll-off, things like that, we really haven't seen any significant shifts except in the partisan transformation of the South, that switch from Democrat to Republican that we've all observed. So I don't expect anything to be different if we were to bring this up to the 2014 election. Now, based on what I'm going to talk to you about, I want to distinguish among types of ads. So the Brennan Center, as well as CMAG and all of these other groups that categorize elections, use three basic categories for describing the content or the tone of judicial elections. First are promotions, which are exactly what the name suggests. So a promotion is an ad that says, I am a great judge, I should be chosen for the state Supreme Court. So they're positive, they're focused on one particular candidate. Contrast ads are comparisons, as the title would suggest. I am a great judge, Mr. Smith is a terrible judge. So there are partly positive, partly negative, and then we have attack ads. Justice Smith, or Mr. Smith, who wants my job, would be a terrible judge. So these are mutually exclusive, exhaustive categories. We've categorized ads into one of three, and what I'm going to do is then look at the impact of these different types of ads on judicial decision, on ballot roll-off and the electoral performance of incumbents. So how am I measuring the electoral performance of incumbents? The percent vote for the incumbent, relative to everybody else. So the number of votes divided by the number of votes cast in the race. Again, ballot roll-off is the percent of voters who did not vote in the Supreme Court election. They rolled off the ballot relative to the top race on the ballot, and that could be a presidential race, a gubernatorial election, or a senatorial election. The specific elections I'm looking at in terms of incumbent vote shares are 95 contested elections from 2002 to 2008 in 19 states, in which incumbents were seeking re-election. So I'm particularly interested in what happens to incumbents as opposed to open seat races, which are something different entirely. And then that gives us 56 nonpartisan elections, 39 partisan elections. And then in the ballot roll-up models, I'm looking at the 96 contested elections from 2002 to 2008 in 18 states that had state Supreme Court elections held simultaneously with either a presidential, gubernatorial, or senatorial election. So we need those elections in order to have a baseline measure of citizen participation. We get 51 nonpartisan elections and 45 partisan elections using this method, and this is open races, open seats, as well as incumbents. Because again, we're looking at voter participation, not incumbents in these particular elections. I want to talk also about how we measure campaign effects. So I'm going to show you some models, and again, I'm speaking generally. I won't go into a lot of detail about them, but I do want everybody to understand what the focus of the models are. And so first of all, when we're looking at incumbent vote shares and we're trying to measure campaign effects, the first thing I did was separate the ads by tone, so into promotion, contrast, and attack ads, and then look at these separately for incumbents and challengers. So attack ads against the incumbent, attack ads against the challenger, promote ads for the incumbent, promote ads for the challenger, contrast ads for the incumbent, contrast ads for the challenger. And what I did was just look at the number of airings of these, not ads, airings. How many times was each ad aired? Again, regardless of sponsors, so these could be ads from challengers, incumbents, groups, political parties, and then transform them to natural logarithms because we would expect there to be diminishing returns as we get to higher levels of ads. I also calculated it looking at net effects of differences between challengers and incumbents, so I can show you those models as well if you like. But I tried this 2 different ways in order to have some confidence in the robustness of the results. In terms of ballot roll-off, what we want to know is what's the overall stimulation in the race. So what's the level of advertising? And again, this is all consistent with the extant literature on the topic. And I'm just looking at the total number of ads aired in each race, regardless of the sponsor, and again, transformed into natural logs because of a diminished expectation of impact at the higher levels. You get less bang for the buck the more you do it, right? So I also want to talk about campaign spending because the political scientists in the room will be concerned about any potential collinearity between the ads and spending. Actually, the correlation is not as high as you would think. There are lots of things that go into a campaign that are not related to advertising. And so it's not as much of a problem, but I tried to measure it a number of different ways, to be sure that I'm trying to do a good job statistically here. So I've looked in terms of spending at differences between incumbents and challengers. I also looked just at the total amount of spending separately by the incumbent and the challenger. And when we do that, we want to adjust by the voting age population, and I converted to $2,002 for those of you who would be interested in that. And then ballot roll-off models, again, total spending, because what we want to know in ballot roll-off is what is the overall level of stimulation in the race, not what incumbents and challengers are doing necessarily. And again, adjusted by voting age population and converted to $2,002. So if you can't read this table, don't worry about it. I'll just tell you the gist of what it says. For those of you who can read the table, what you know is that this is basically the kind of model you see in any kind of estimate of incumbent vote shares. What I'm trying to predict is incumbent vote share, identify the things that have an effect on incumbent vote share. And what this table shows very clearly is that attack ads against the incumbent in nonpartisan elections have a negative statistically significant impact, but that attack ads in partisan elections do not. So the interaction term is significant. So there are, in fact, significant differences in the way these two variables affect. But, however, the attack ads against the incumbent time partisan is not statistically different from 0. So that's basically what this is showing. So, yes, attack ads have a negative effect, but only in nonpartisan elections. And then everything else pretty much works the way we would expect it to in a vote shares model. So there's nothing remarkable about any of this, relatively speaking. It's very consistent with what everything else has shown. And what do we see in ballot roll-off models? Well, attack airings, actually that negative sign in front of attack airings shows that attack airings in nonpartisan elections reduce ballot roll-off. So most people would think of that as a positive result, that in fact you're enhancing the ability of voters to participate. It doesn't have any effect at all in nonpartisan elections. And again, everything else looks pretty much the way we would expect these types of models to work if we didn't have the campaign ads. So basically what I did was take the campaign variables and add them to well-established models of vote shares or ballot roll-off. So what's the short story? In partisan elections, attack ads have no harmful effects on the electoral performance of incumbents or the propensity of citizens to vote. They do not conform to the conventional wisdom again, widely endorsed. Nonpartisan elections are different. In nonpartisan elections, attack ads do reduce the incumbent's vote shares. They do have that harmful impact on incumbents. Now, they don't necessarily determine the election. In fact, the effect wasn't that large. But in a close race, a difference of 2 or 3 percentage points can mean the difference between winning and losing, right? So they do have an effect. But on the positive side, they improve citizen participation. So good news and bad news about attack ads in partisan races. Why on earth would these be the results? Well, again, well-established theories of political science speak to this. Partisan labels are the most important heuristic in American elections. Most of us, when we go to vote, a very sizable percent, maybe 85% of the electorate, when we vote on the basis of party. And that's a pretty good cue. If you don't know anything else about most political candidates except their political party, you can vote very smartly. So if all you knew about John McCain and Barack Obama were their partisan identifications, you could have made a relatively rational choice in that decision. Okay, so generally speaking, that's how Americans vote. So when we add party labels to judges, and we can argue about whether that's accurately labeling or not, but it makes it easier to vote. And not only that, but when people vote on the basis of partisanship, it means that these idiosyncratic forces in elections, like attack ads, don't have as much of an impact. So we shield incumbents from those effects, and we make it easier to vote. So incumbent vote shares are protected, citizen participation goes up. What happens when we take off those partisan labels? Well, again, nonpartisan elections in general significantly reduce the information available to voters. You can't look at a ballot and know how to vote. You have to know more to cast a smart vote in that context. And what we know happens in nonpartisan elections is that means a very sizable proportion of the electorate simply doesn't vote. They don't have any idea how to vote. They don't have enough information. And again, that also means that incumbents are more susceptible to external threats like attack ads. Attack ads and other campaign messages fill the void. The positive is promoting citizen participation. Negative is enhancing the impact of disparaging messages. So what would we say about theory, going back to the beginning? Those concerned about the pernicious effects of campaign negativity were right, in some sense, but they were wrong about the types of elections to which their arguments best apply. It's probably not the case with presidential and congressional and gubernatorial elections that we're going to see these harmful effects. But with nonpartisan judicial elections and potentially retention elections, that's something completely different. And as far as the judicial reform community, those concerned especially about attacks on the judiciary and thinking about judges being different were right, but they were right for the wrong reasons. It's not because judges are intrinsically different, it's because the elections are intrinsically different. When you take party labels off the ballot, you change the political game. So again, this work is in the nascent stages. We really need to know so much more before we can reach any definitive conclusions. And keep in mind, I'm only looking at a very small slice of the judicial elections pie here. So my findings are very focused. They have implications for whether we elect judges and money in politics and all those sorts of things. But again, I'm just looking at a very small piece of the pie here. So should we be worried about negativity? Yes, especially in the wake of Citizens United, as many people have said publicly. We should be worried about negativity. We should be worried about money in politics. And we should be worried about judicial elections. But we should also bring to those worries facts, evidence, information that helps us make a sound and reliable choice. about whether we elect judges, how we regulate money, and so forth. But I would also say we also need, in this discussion of judicial election, we need to be talking about problems with other selection systems as well. There is no such thing as a perfect way to select judges. Pick your poison. There are negatives with every single system. My concerns are these, and I think many people have also voiced these concerns, with commission-based appointments, particularly those dominated by bar associations. I would be concerned about the elitist nature of those appointments and the closed-door nature of those appointments. Much has been written in law reviews about these particular problems, and they need to be addressed. What also needs to be addressed that really isn't being discussed, and this shocks me actually, are appointment systems in the United States in which judges must be reappointed by another political branch in order to retain their seats. So 12 of those states, I showed you 12 states that have appointment systems. Only 3 of those states give lifetime tenure to judges, so they resemble the federal model, right? And that's Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. In those other 9 states, judges are appointed for an initial term, but they have to be reappointed by a governor or the state legislature. That suggests a very real problem in limiting judicial independence and impairing the process of judicial review. We know, for example, Paul Brace and I did a study looking at the practice of judicial review, and in fact, where judges are retained by the legislature, you see a lot fewer challenges to legislative statutes on their dockets and a much lower willingness to overturn those statutes. So again, when we're thinking about judicial elections, we need to think about the big picture. The big picture not only in terms of what science tells us about these elections, but also relative to other forms of selection systems, and to start to think more systematically about how best to staff these important courts, especially state Supreme Courts, and do the best possible job. And I think we're quite a long way from that conversation.
Okay, thank you. We have 10 minutes or so for questions and answers. That's okay, it's our fault.
Yes, please.
So you measure the partisan and nonpartisan based upon there being IDs on the ballot, correct?
Right.
But I imagine there's variation
Yes.
in laws across states as to how judges can identify themselves with a party outside of being in the ballot. So do you know, or do you think there are nonpartisan races that look like partisan races because everybody knows candidate X is a Republican and everybody
Absolutely.
knows candidate Y is a Democrat?
Yes, and in fact, quite a bit has been written on that, and I'll refer you again to Bert Kritzer's book. Bert looks, yes, so they're called nonpartisan elections, but they're intensely partisan, Michigan and Ohio. Everybody knows. And they know we know in those states because partisan nomination devices are used, but in other states, even without the partisan nomination devices, we know who's a Democrat and who's a Republican.
So in your data, do the results from those cases look more like partisan cases?
You know, it's hard to do because there weren't enough cases to do that. So to get back to Bert's book, Bert does this really interesting thing. He looks at county level election returns, and in nonpartisan elections, he compares the judicial races to the other partisan races on the ballot, depending on what it is. So it could be a presidential race or whatever it is. And the patterns look very similar. So a lot of people don't vote in nonpartisan elections. The ballot roll-off is huge. But when they do vote, they know what they're doing. And so they do know, you know, in those states where there are meaningful differences between political parties, they do know that. Mm-hmm. And so those races look just as partisan elections. Yes. So it is complicated. And, you know, these 4 methods that I showed you, there are all sorts of variations in how these things work. And we're just beginning to understand all of that.
I wonder if you make a strong argument if we're going to have elections for judges, that they should be partisan rather than nonpartisan. But your data also covers a period that corresponds with high partisan polarization
Yes.
and ideologically sorted parties. And I wonder if the case wouldn't be as strong in a system that didn't have partisan polarization and sorted parties.
That's a really great question, and what I would say is I can't look at campaign effects because we don't have those data, but we have studied elections all the way back through the 1940s, and the results are the same. I mean, that's what Bert is showing us. I have an article in the APSR looking at elections from 1980 to 1995, and again, they don't have the campaign effects, but they have everything else, and you see the same results. So partisan elections are partisan elections. And nonpartisan elections, it depends on the state, but can be intensely partisan. But I think you're right in the sense that polarization has only intensified those underlying patterns, and we'll need a longer period of study to examine them more carefully.
One of your last points compared judges that have lifetime appointments versus those that needed to be reappointed by the judge or the state legislature, and how that affected judicial review. Did you compare how judges who needed to go up for public election, what their rate of judicial review was or their rate of overturning laws was compared to those who had lifetime appointments or had to be reappointed?
So the comparison was to people who, the comparison we drew was people who do not have to be reappointed versus those who do by an elite. And so that's the comparison we drew. And people who have to be retained by the legislature or governor, as I said, are much less likely, as opposed to the others. So again, these rules matter. How we design courts makes a difference. It matters whether they have high salaries, enough staff. I mean, if you really want to protect judges, I mean, to go back to one of the models, did you notice professionalization in the models? Judicial professionalization is a measure of how many resources we give to courts. So the salaries of the judges, their caseloads, what proportions of their dockets are discretionary versus mandatory, and so forth. So when we professionalize courts, we spend money to get the best people, because that's what we're doing, and give them a reasonable opportunity to do their jobs. Professionalism reduces the impact of all of these negative things. It really shields incumbents. Why? Because you get really great people who do a great job. And so, again, all of these things matter, whether judges are elected or not, their terms of office. All of these things have implications for how courts work. And so I think more and more we should be focused on how we're designing courts and what kinds of results we want to achieve, and then take into account these rules that might forward or retard that progress, depending on what we know at the time.
Time for one more question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was curious, you had mentioned earlier that the range of your data set was from 2002 to 2008, and you mentioned that there was a little bit, it was hard to find data from before 2002, and I run into this problem myself with judicial advertising. So what things did you have to do to sort of maybe work around that data limitation, and how possible do you think it is to fill in that gap and go further beyond 2002 into the past?
I think that's extraordinarily difficult because CMAG didn't collect. I mean, we have these data because of CMAG, right? And the Wisconsin Advertising Project and a lot of other people that invested a tremendous amount of time and energy to collect them. But that raises a really good point. Thank you so much for asking that question, because I want to make another point. We assume that the ads started in 2000. And why do we assume that? Because that's when we have the data. And you see that over and over. In the Brennan Center report, 2000 was a watershed year. This is when well, it's also the year we started to know something about it. And one of the things I report is a conversation with Chief Justice Tom Phillips, former Chief Justice Tom Phillips of the Texas Supreme Court. Chief Justice Phillips is a longtime advocate of judicial reform, and he spoke to us about elections in Texas for the Supreme Court in the 80s and early 90s. And what Chief Justice Phillips reported is that all of those elections had advertising, and not only had advertising, but had really nasty attack advertising. So, one justice was criticized for where she went to law school. I mean, if you just go down the list. One justice filed complaints against his opponents with the Judicial Ethics Commission, and then read an ad that his colleagues were all under investigation. So this has been rock'em sock'em politics in Texas. Now, it's not anymore because everybody's Republican. They elect Republican judges. If you're a Democrat, you're not going to win. I mean, so it's not necessary anymore. But so Justice Phillips, if we looked at the ads, if we looked at the Brennan Center ads from 2002, even 2000 through 2008, and we looked for states that had advertising and states that, including attack advertising, Texas isn't on the list. So you would look at those data and you would say, well, I guess Texas hasn't entered this age of campaign advertising. Well, yes, it did. You just did it a long time ago. And we can go back. So there are other studies. Miss Professor Hall, what was his? Kermit Hall did some really interesting legal histories going back to the late 1800s, early 1900s of California, Texas, and a couple of other states, I forget which. But he also showed that even back in the 1880s, there were these nasty ads. Now, it wasn't television, obviously, but nasty ads. Some kid, some child of modest means family was killed in a railroad accident, and there was an editorial run in the newspaper about how the judge seeking re-election didn't care about the lives of poor children. He only cared about the railroad in a tort case that was decided about the child's death. So we have to be very, very careful in talking about trends in campaign politics because we don't have those data. But it's a certainty that they weren't invented in 2000. And how one goes about getting that information, I really don't know.
All right, well, I'm afraid our time